Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing with my consumables series, and today we are covering arrows. Now, you might think that arrows are only for archers, but that's actually not true. Any character with a ranged attack, which is in fact every character in Baldur's Gate 3, because you can always have a melee weapon and a ranged weapon equipped, can use these special arrows. So not only are these an incredibly powerful tool for archers to actually hit enemies with, there are many of these arrows that have effects that work just fine even if you don't have a great ranged attack, and you can place them on the ground, miss with them, or even hit allies with them for incredible effects. For this reason, I think it's actually quite important to know what all of these arrows do, how to use them in your party, even if you don't have a dedicated archer, but of course especially if you do have a dedicated archer, and which ones are worth collecting and which ones aren't. The really great thing about these special arrows, though, is that they are free. There's almost no opportunity cost for using them, other than the cost of the arrow itself. Anytime you would be firing a normal arrow attack, a normal ranged attack, you can replace it with one of these special arrows for free. It doesn't require an extra action, it doesn't cost you any damage or chance to hit, it just powers up your character for absolutely no downside. Anytime there's something that's all upside and no downside, that's something that we definitely want to pay attention to, so it's very important, I think, to pay attention to these arrows, because they just power up your party completely for free. I've divided these arrows into 6 tiers of power level. In S plus tier, I have items that are entirely outside the intended balance of Baldur's Gate. These break the game completely and, as a result, are extremely powerful. These are the ones that you absolutely want to use in order to maximize the power of your character. In S tier, I've got ones that are extremely useful, powerful, with a great ability that will be impactful throughout the game. You'll want to stockpile as many of these as possible and use them regularly in combats throughout the game. In A tier, I have ones that are either very useful for specific encounters or marginally less useful for lots of encounters, but they have an impactful enough effect that they're definitely worth keeping around. In B tier, I have ones that will come up occasionally when you don't have a better arrow to use, although because the opportunity cost is so low, remember, even the weakest of these arrows are still definitely worth picking up. In C tier, I've got ones with very marginal effects, so they'll be used very rarely, but may be useful in some narrow circumstances. And in D tier, I have ones that are rarely worth picking up because they are almost never going to be useful throughout the entire game. Finally, I should mention that there are 2 arrows that exist in the game that don't show up in this tier list, the barbed arrow and the arrow of piercing. These are unique arrows that you can only get a very small number of, so it's not worth considering whether to stockpile them or not because you can't. But neither of them are terribly useful anyways. Alright, without any further ado, let's start rating some arrows. First up, the Arrow of Acid. So these 4 elemental arrows, Acid, Fire, Ice, and Lightning, are going to be some of the first arrows that you find in the game, and some of the most common that you find throughout the game. These are going to be your bread and butter special arrows, the ones that you use when you have no other particular needs from other arrows, and therefore are always going to be at least marginally useful because they are just a good fallback option. It's just strictly better to fire one of these in most circumstances than to fire just a normal arrow attack, and so you're always going to want a backup supply of these just to have the chance at doing a little bit of extra damage. The Arrow of Acid does 2d4 of acid damage in a radius around whatever you hit with it, with a dexterity save to completely negate the damage. So the 2d4 extra damage, and the dexterity save is DC 12, so most enemies are going to pass that with relative ease. And 2d4 damage isn't a lot. Dexterity save to negate completely means that most of the time enemies will not be taking the additional damage from the Arrow of Acid when you hit them with the acid explosion, though it can be a nice boost, especially in the early game, in order to just get a little bit of damage, and you know, it's free, and a free chance at extra damage is absolutely worth taking under most circumstances, so there's only so bad that this arrow can be. However, the acid arrow has an additional effect, which is that it also, at the location that you hit, creates a 7-foot radius acid surface. An acid surface gives anything that's standing on it with no saving throw just a flat -2 penalty to armor class. When this is fired from a bow that's already targeting an enemy, that's an amazing effect to just get for free tacked on to any other shot. Archers in particular really want to be landing their shots because almost every archer in the game is going to take sharpshooter as a feat, and the sharpshooter feat means that you do a lot of damage provided you can hit, but makes it less likely for you to hit. Archer builds, therefore, are often predicated around trying to mitigate the downsides of Sharpshooter as much as possible through gaining advantage with bonus action hides, through the archery fighting style giving you extra hits, through precision attack from Battlemaster fighter levels, and so on. And the Arrow of Acid is an extremely important tool in your arsenal. The first attack that you fire with your Acid Arrow will often have advantage because often you will be firing your first shot from hiding, and that means that every subsequent shot that you take on that turn, or if the enemy stays in the same location, has just a +2 chance to hit because the enemy has -2 AC. That's like getting the archery fighting style for free, the most powerful fighting style in the game, and is incredibly powerful because it also, of course, stacks with other sources of bonus hit chance. The Acid Arrow, therefore, is just excellent for any character that's going to be making multiple ranged attacks in a turn, which is every dedicated archer that gets extra attack, but also is going to be very powerful for any character that can fire an arrow before starting combat and then fire it again, like an assassin rogue, or has a special attack in the beginning of combat, like a Gloomstalker Ranger. And you'll notice that I'm naming a lot of characters that are very important components of most archer builds. So the Acid Arrow synergizes incredibly well with what archers are doing, gives you a very significant boost to your damage overall, and should be your opening volley in most combats. You give up nothing and you gain a lot of bonus chance to hit, which is all that an archer build cares about. So the Acid Arrow, I think, is actually excellent. The damage from it is mostly irrelevant because the 2d4 damage with the dex save to negate means that will almost never come up. But the Acid Surface for no action taken is a really powerful effect, and the Acid Arrow is S tier. The Arrow of Fire. So the Arrow of Fire is exactly the same as the Arrow of Acid in its basic effect. It does a dex save DC 12 to negate a 2d4 damage explosion, fire damage around the target. Dex save DC 12 for 2d4 damage, again, is not a significant effect, so the Fire Arrow, similar to the Acid Arrow, is just a nice little boost to every shot that you have, but is not going to significantly improve your damage under most circumstances. However, just like the Acid Arrow, it creates a surface at the location, and in this case it is a Fire Surface. Fire Surface inflicts 1d4 of damage to enemies starting their turn in it, and also causes burning, which can inflict additional damage over subsequent turns. And so you're getting at least a guaranteed extra 1d4 damage out of the Fire Arrow every time you shoot, including if you miss. That's pretty useful. It can also be used to light up explosives, light surfaces, light even torches if you want to light those. So it has some additional utility uses just because the ability to set fires is pretty useful in combat. But mostly you're doing this to give you the option to finish off low health enemies if they're near an enemy that you want to target with an attack anyways, or just deal a little bit of extra guaranteed damage to an enemy. Under most circumstances, 1d4 extra damage is not going to be huge, but this can, in some encounters, be like 2d4 or 3d4 extra damage if enemies are tightly packed, which from a single attack is not bad. The Fire Arrow obviously loses value as the game goes on as well, because of course 1d4 damage just becomes less and less useful, and enemies are more likely to have burning immunities and fire resistances as the game goes on as well. I think that the Fire Arrow is a solid arrow that you'll use pretty frequently just for the extra damage. It's a good default when you have nothing else to use. So I'm going to place it in A tier because I think that you will use this one pretty regularly and you'll never be sad to have them in your inventory, but it's not going to be a major benefit most of the time. But the extra damage definitely comes in handy, so A tier. The Arrow of Ice. So the Arrow of Ice, same thing as the others, DC 12 dex save or 2d4 cold damage, and the surface that it creates is an ice surface. Now, ice surfaces in Baldur's Gate are ridiculously powerful, because enemies who are on the ice surface have to make a dex save or fall prone. Now, in this case, this ice surface uses the save DC of the arrow, not your character's save DC, so it's going to be a DC 12 dex save or fall prone, but DC 12 dex or fall prone is much better than or take some damage, because falling prone costs enemies turns. Putting up an ice surface is always a powerful option, and against enemies with low dexterity saving throws can cost them entire turns, because if they fall prone on their turn, they lose the rest of their turn. So if they start walking and fall over, they just lose their turn. Spellcasters lose concentration immediately if they fail the dex save, and so on. So this has a lot of utility in terms of just putting up ice surfaces under enemies and having them fall over. The low save DC is definitely a downside, but even low save DC on crowd control effects that you get for free is pretty powerful overall. And it's also worth noting that the ice arrow combines very well with other arrows, especially the fire arrow. You could fire an ice arrow, enemies have to save or fall over, then fire a fire arrow, which melts the ice surface into water, and then a lightning arrow can turn that into an electric surface for more damage, or another fire arrow can turn it into steam to get them wet to double cold damage. Another source of cold damage can freeze it again. Potentially, if you use Ray of Frost or something from an ally, you can freeze it at a higher save DC. So there's a lot of synergies with the ice arrow, just because it creates ice which turns into water, and water is just a very powerful thing to be able to create in Baldur's Gate. So not only is this just a powerful arrow in and of itself, it also has a lot of synergies and cool tricks that you can do with it. Making steam clouds is very useful throughout the game, and so on. So I like the ice arrow quite a bit. It will lose some value in the late game, because a lot of archers are going to want to use cold damage weapons plus the snowburst ring to just get this effect on every single attack. But if you're not doing that, then the ice arrows are very useful, and they're also useful for other non-archer characters to carry, because sometimes a DC 12 ice surface is just a great way to use your turn. You can place that under any enemy if your party member has nothing better to do, and often get decent value out of it. I'm going to say that the ice arrows are going to be S tier as well as the acid arrows, because I think they are just very strong and continuously find use throughout the game, so I do recommend stockpiling these as much as possible. The Arrow of Lightning. So the lightning arrow, exactly the same as all the other elemental damage arrows, DC 12 dex save for 2d4 damage, except that unlike the other three arrows, for some reason the lightning arrow does not create a surface. This is especially weird because there are lightning surfaces in the game, like the chromatic orb lightning spell creates a lightning surface, so why the lightning arrow doesn't, I couldn't tell you, but it doesn't. So all we're getting out of this is the damage and the potential to electrify stuff if we want to. Electrifying stuff can be a little bit of extra damage if you hit a puddle of water or a cloud of steam with this. It can do a little bit of extra damage, but mostly this is just going to be a small chance at doing a marginal amount of extra damage in an AoE around your target. It's not useless. I mean, it still does. It's still a benefit, and it's a free benefit, so it's something that you will take, and if you have nothing better to do, then shoot a lightning arrow for sure. But overall, these lightning arrows are not worth stocking up on, because they just don't have much effect outside of the damage, and the damage mostly won't happen. So it's a C tier arrow. It's not completely worthless, and you'll keep the ones that you get, and you'll fire them when you have nothing better to do, but given that it doesn't have any additional effect other than the very small chance at dealing very small amounts of damage, I don't recommend going out of your way to get lightning arrows. Next, all the arrows of slaying. So all of these work in the same way, so I will talk at first about how they function, and then I will go through each of these individually, and we'll talk about sort of how many enemies and how important the encounters are that you're going to face for each of these enemy categories. I will avoid spoilers when talking about them, but I will give you a general sense of how important it is to carry these arrows, how dangerous the types of encounters that they target are, as we go through them one by one. But first, let's talk about how they actually function. So the arrows of slaying double your damage against enemies of the appropriate type. The way that this double damage works is a little unintuitive. It doesn't work by just like rolling normal damage and then multiplying that by 2. You actually roll your damage twice, and it includes every effect that's added to your damage. So if you have bonus damage on your weapon, like if you have a bow that does an extra d6 of fire damage in addition to its normal damage, that gets rolled again, so that damage is doubled. If you have gloves that add extra damage to your attacks, that damage is doubled. If you have the sharpshooter feat, that damage is doubled. So anything that you add to your damage is doubled, which means that the amount of damage that these do against the appropriate targets can be quite massive if you have a character who's spec'd specifically into doing archery damage. These obviously don't have a lot of use as utility options. They are meant for actual archers to fire, so don't put them on your other party members. But for archers, against an appropriate target, this is a massive damage boost. It's also worth noting that because this does all of your damage twice, it means that any effects that trigger on you doing damage also get doubled. Radiant Orb stacks, Reverberation stacks, Arcane Acuity stacks, all of those get doubled if you have the appropriate ways to trigger them when you fire one of these arrows, because it actually triggers all of your damage twice. And if you have, on Tactician mode or below, if you have other damage riders attached to these, those also get doubled. If you have other damage rider sources attached to these, those get doubled. So the slaying arrows can often end up increasing your damage on lower difficulty levels by numbers in the hundreds if you've been stacking to cheat with damage riders. Even without that, though, it's going to be a significant damage boost to any character that is spec'd into doing archery damage against the appropriate target. So if there are encounters where they are useful, it's very much worth carrying these, because not only are they just a little bit of free damage, they're a lot of free damage, and all of the effects that you get whenever you attack also trigger, and a lot of characters will have effects on attacks that you want to trigger multiple times. So these slaying arrows, by default, are excellent for those reasons. The Arrow of Beast Slaying. So the Arrow of Beast Slaying is only available starting near the end of Act 1 from merchants, so by the time you get these arrows, you've almost certainly fought all of the most difficult fights against beasts in the game. So the chances of you actually needing to carry a bunch of arrows of Beast Slaying for the later game are not particularly high. Obviously, for some of the beast fights that you will fight later on, some of the beasts that you'll fight later on, these are still very good. They do a bunch of additional damage, but those are not going to be particularly challenging encounters by the time you reach them, typically. So the Arrow of Beast Slaying, despite being a decent arrow, just targets an enemy type that you will not usually be suffering too much threat from. So the Arrow of Beast Slaying I'm going to put in C tier. The Arrow of Construct Slaying. So the Construct Slaying arrow doubles your damage against constructs, or rolls your damage twice against constructs. And constructs are some of the more difficult late-game encounters, especially throughout Act 3, so that's definitely a very powerful tool to have at your disposal. One thing to note about the Construct Slaying arrows is that many constructs do have resistance or even immunity to piercing damage. The Construct Slaying arrow will not bypass that without other sources of being able to bypass that, so piercing damage against constructs can be a little weak. Also, any constructs that have mechanics that require you to exceed certain amounts of damage in a single instance, this won't help with, because it actually just makes multiple instances of damage, and that is a mechanic that you'll face with constructs, as well as with a number of other enemies throughout the game. So the Construct Slaying arrow doesn't necessarily just completely solve construct-based encounters, but is still very good, and it's an important encounter to be able to do well in. I'm going to put the Construct Slaying arrows in A tier, because they are very powerful, but there are some things that specifically hold back these arrows from functioning as well as you'd like against constructs. They're still just way, way better than a normal arrow, though, so an excellent one to have around for some of the harder encounters in the game. The Arrow of Elemental Slaying. So these are only available starting in Act 2, by which point you've fought a lot of the more dangerous elementals in the game. Many Act 1 elementals are where you're most likely to die to an elemental. However, there are 2 late-game encounters that I can think of that contain quite dangerous elementals, so the ability to drop those for the late-game encounters is quite valuable in my opinion. The Elemental Slaying arrow, therefore, comes up in a couple encounters in the late game, and is very useful for those encounters, so I'm going to put it in A tier. You would wish that you got it a little bit earlier to use against the early game enemies, of which many of the more dangerous elementals show up in the very early game, but there's a couple late game encounters where these will be very nice to have, so A tier is where they belong. The Arrow of Fiend Slaying. So there's a lot of fiends in this game. They show up pretty frequently throughout the game. But with a couple notable exceptions, it's very rare that a fiend encounter is going to actually be a particularly dangerous encounter. There's a lot of encounters against that are kind of like filler random encounters against fiends that will not give your party particular trouble. And then, of course, a couple encounters that are more difficult. Similar to Construct and Elemental Slaying arrows, these will show up throughout the game and be useful throughout the game, and because they are extremely useful in some specific encounters that you're going to need a boost for, I'm going to place them also in A tier. Just a very solid item that will help you out in some of the more challenging encounters throughout the game. The Arrow of Monstrosity Slaying. So, monstrosities mostly only appear in one zone in the game, and it's in Act 1, and these arrows are only available near the end of Act 1. So, if you play Act 1 in a certain order, you can get a lot of use out of the Monstrosity Slaying arrows. If you don't play it in that order, then you're only going to be using them in, I think, like 2 encounters for the rest of the game, both quite easy encounters, relatively speaking, so the Monstrosity Slaying arrow, depending on what order you play the game in, may or may not actually see any use. Either way, monstrosities just tend not to be very challenging enemies throughout the entire game, and so I'm going to put the Monstrosity Slaying arrow, similar to the Beast Slaying arrow, in C tier, because I just don't think that you really need to stockpile these. Most of the encounters that you'll fight against monstrosities are just not that difficult, so you won't really need the boost. Obviously, the boost can be helpful for those, but you don't need to go out of your way to pick these up. The Arrow of Undead Slaying. The Undead Slaying arrow targets undead, which are one of the most common enemy types throughout the game. Undead will show up in all 3 acts in large numbers, and some of the most dangerous encounters in the game are against undead, so the Undead Slaying arrow is definitely worth grabbing as many of them as you can. You'll absolutely want them for some encounters, which are extremely difficult, and so the Undead Slaying arrow can help you ace some of the most challenging encounters in the game, while also just providing excellent utility throughout the many, many times that you're going to fight undead throughout Baldur's Gate 3. S tier arrow for sure. The Arrow of Aberration Slaying. So, Baldur's Gate 3 is an incredibly aberration-centric campaign. They're some of the main antagonists throughout the entire game, and so obviously you're going to be fighting a lot of aberrations throughout the campaign. You would think, at least. You actually have surprisingly few encounters against aberrations. They definitely come up. You will fight a lot of them throughout the course of the game, but for a campaign where there's such a core component of the story, I mean, you start on a Mind Flayer ship and everything spirals out from there, there are surprisingly few battles against aberrations throughout the entire game. However, of course, they are extremely important enemies to get rid of, and typically in the encounters where they do show up, they are the most priority targets in those encounters, and ones you absolutely have to get rid of as soon as possible. So I still am going to place the Aberration Slaying arrow in S tier, because it is very useful in some of the most important fights in the game and some of the most dangerous enemies in the game, which are relatively common. But it is worth noting that for a campaign whose story centers around aberrations, you actually fight surprisingly few of them throughout the course of Baldur's Gate 3. The Arrow of Dragon Slaying. So for a game called Dungeons & Dragons, there's awfully few dragons in Baldur's Gate 3. There are only a very small number of encounters with actual dragons that you will face, though fittingly, of course, they are some of the most dangerous enemies in the entire game. Whether you do the optional encounters with dragons or not, it's still very useful to have dragon slaying arrows around, because dragons are super dangerous and incredibly powerful enemies, and so the dragon slaying arrow can be used to get through some of the most dangerous encounters in the game much more smoothly, double damage against them, especially because you'll be able to have stockpiled enough dragon slaying arrows to just use only those against the very few dragons that show up. So I recommend doing that, and you can carry your dragon slaying arrows to the encounters where they're useful. A tier arrow, because of how dangerous the encounters against dragons are. Finally, the arrow of Humanoid Slaying. Well, something like half of the enemies in the game are humanoid, including several of the most dangerous encounters in the entire game will be fought against humans or humanoid enemies, and so the arrow of Humanoid Slaying comes up constantly. This is one that you'll be using all the time. There's like no routing that you can do. There's no playthrough of Baldur's Gate, with the exception maybe of some weird broken speedrun strategies where you won't be fighting humanoids constantly throughout the entire game. So the Humanoid Slaying arrow will always be incredibly powerful and incredibly useful, and should definitely be stockpiled for every party. S tier. The Arrow of Darkness. Well, this has one of my favorite words in the title. Darkness is one of the most powerful spells in Baldur's Gate 3 because it renders anything in it completely immune to ranged attacks, so it's incredible defensively, and it also renders anything in it blind, so it's incredible offensively. Either of those effects tacked onto an arrow, so you can basically be casting a level 2 spell in exchange for just an attack action, is incredible. This is actually usually best carried by characters that aren't archers, so that you can use it just as a cast of darkness for your party, with the ability to just have a level 2 spell available on any other random party member is going to be incredible, and so this is one that you'll typically want to stack on non-archer characters, though if your archer has a way to see through darkness, you can also use it to blind enemies, and while still attacking them. You can also just use it to blind enemies with the last shot of your bow for the turn and land darkness on enemies for allies. For more on that, definitely check out my darkness themed party build guide, where I talk about how to use this as an archer, because it's very powerful to be able to land a level 2 spell in addition to a highly damaging attack on an enemy, especially such a good one. Arrows of Darkness increase the number of darkness casts that your party is going to have if you're a darkness build. They're incredibly useful for warlocks, so that you can spend your spells on non-darkness things while still having a cast of darkness. And of course, the very important part about the Arrow of Darkness is that they don't take concentration in order to have the darkness effect up. When you fire the Arrow of Darkness, it just makes 3 turns of darkness, which is enough for most encounters, in a smaller radius than the darkness spell, but still very serviceable. And having that in addition to just not having to concentrate on it is incredibly powerful. So this can be useful for your spellcasters to have basically a second level 2 spell that they're concentrating on without having that they can just spend their turn casting by firing an Arrow of Darkness, while still concentrating on a different spell for their combat. Incredibly useful for warlocks, incredibly useful for non-warlocks, incredibly useful for every party overall. The Arrow of Darkness is also quite easy to acquire. It is available very, very early, and you can stockpile these for the entire game. Darkness is just such an incredibly powerful effect in Baldur's Gate 3 that if you are doing if you have any warlocks in your party or the items that give blind immunity, the Darkness Arrow just completely breaks the action economy of the game, because it lets you cast spells as attack actions. It lets you just completely ruin encounter balance by having darkness up all over the battlefield on you and on enemies. In combination with casts of darkness, it's even more powerful. So the Darkness Arrow is just incredibly worth carrying around and using frequently. The only question is it S tier or is it S plus tier? And I think that darkness is just such a brokenly powerful effect in Baldur's Gate 3 if you are making any effort to abuse it at all, that I'm going to place the Arrow of Darkness in S plus tier. If you aren't a build that is attempting to abuse darkness, so you don't have, let's say, the Eversight Ring, and you don't have warlocks in your party, and so on, you're not attempting to abuse it, then it's just an S tier arrow, because it's still just an incredibly powerful offensive effect. No save blinds combined with damage are really, really good. But in any circumstance where you're trying to maximize the potential of the Darkness Arrow, it's S plus tier, so we're going to place it there because it's just so incredibly powerful. The Arrow of Ilmater. So I don't know if it's Ilmater, Ilmater, pronounced some other way, but it's a made-up word, so I'm just going to say Ilmater because it sounds better to me. I will also say that I didn't notice until I was looking at the image this large that it's 3 finger bones for the arrowhead, so that's kind of cool. Great job on the art there, I love that. But the Arrow of Ilmater does 1d4 extra necrotic damage if you hit with it, and then also prevents the enemy from healing for 1 turn. The 1d4 extra necrotic damage, only if you hit, is pretty weak compared to the damage riders of other arrows. Like the fire arrow will always do at least 1d4 extra damage because it sets the ground on fire, hit or miss. So the Ilmater arrow does less damage than the fire arrow if you're just looking for a little bit of extra guaranteed damage, and doesn't have the chance of doing more damage. But stopping an enemy for healing from a turn is a pretty powerful effect. Unlike many effects in Baldur's Gate, this one ticks down at the end of the enemy turn, so even though it only applies for a one-turn duration, it will actually stop them from healing for a full turn. So the enemies will lose out on any natural regeneration that they might have. They won't be able to drink potions, which the AI will attempt to do sometimes, and they won't be able to cast healing spells on themselves. This is mostly useful against enemies with natural regeneration, because otherwise you have to predict in advance that the enemy has a healing spell and plans to use it on this turn, and in fact, stopping the enemy from healing and so that they choose to do something else on their turn might actually be better, because usually if the AI spends a turn healing, you're happy, so you may actually accidentally help enemies by preventing them from healing with this arrow. But against enemies with natural regeneration who get that healing every turn, this can be an extra 10 damage, an extra 20 damage, depending on how much regeneration they have. That's pretty powerful, and some regenerating enemies are fairly dangerous, though a lot of the regenerating enemies in the game are actually not that dangerous as far as encounters go. This is a pretty marginal effect, but there are some encounters where it's quite powerful. I would say that overall the Ilmater arrow is a B tier arrow. It is going to come up occasionally, and it will be reasonably good when it does, but it's rarely going to win encounters. Now, you can stop enemies from healing constantly by spamming these, and so against enemies who have a lot of healing, you can just apply these turn after turn after turn to stop them from healing forever. This effect is also duplicated by the Bone Chill cantrip, which also gives disadvantage to undead. So it has a little bit more utility, but of course you get this from an arrow. I think that there are few encounters where the Ilmater arrow is going to be better than one of the other arrows. Like just killing the enemy faster with a slaying arrow is typically going to be more useful, but there are definitely times where this will come up and be good, so I'm going to put it in B tier. I think I could see going as high as A tier depending on if you have like if you have a party that does relatively low damage, then you might want to prioritize these a little more because enemy healing is more of a concern for you. But for most parties that are killing enemies in 1 or 2 rounds, the Ilmater arrow just is never going to be a significant amount of damage comparative to other arrows. The arrow of Roaring Thunder. So the Roaring Thunder arrow does no additional damage. It has no damage riders compared to the other arrows, but what it does do is that enemies within the blast radius, a 5-foot blast radius around the target, have to make a strength saving throw or be knocked back 17 feet. So it knocks enemies back pretty far. It's the same as a Thunder Wave or a Gust of Wind spell, and it knocks them back from the center of the explosion, so you can position the direction that you want them to go. However, it doesn't do any additional damage, and if you hit an enemy with the arrow, you don't get to choose what direction all of the other enemies that you're hitting get knocked in. The enemy you're hitting will always go backwards from you, and the other enemies will get knocked around from that central point. And so often, in order to place the effect of the explosion to knock enemies around in a way that you want them to go, you have to actually choose to not hit an enemy with the arrow, foregoing all the damage for your turn. The other thing that holds this arrow back is the save DC. It's a strength save, which enemies will typically be fairly good at. That's one that's relatively weak to target usually, is a strength save. And it's a strength save DC 12 to completely negate the effect. The likelihood that you're going to have to place this not on an enemy, so it actually costs you damage to try to use this some of the time, and the fact that most enemies will effortlessly resist this effect. And while knockback is a very powerful effect, repositioning enemies is a very powerful tool. There's lots of ways to get it in the game, through athletics, through the aforementioned Thunder Wave or Gust of Wind, and through other various tools that have much higher save DCs in order to push enemies around or move them around the battlefield. The Roaring Thunder arrow, I think, is just never going to be good enough to cast, because typically if you try to use it, it's going to cost you damage, and it won't work anyways because the save DC is so low. Against enemies with low strength saves, it could be marginally useful to try to knock like an archer or a mage off of high ground, but there's just much better ways to do that, or just to teleport yourself up to high ground instead. So I just don't recommend the Roaring Thunder arrow. I think there are very few circumstances where it's going to be good. Maybe it's still, when fired at an enemy, it's just damage plus the rider effect. So sometimes you're firing at an enemy who's on high ground, and if you happen to knock them off, then great. So you can use the Roaring Thunder arrows for those circumstances, but I just don't think it's worth stockpiling these because it's so rare that it's going to actually give you an advantage in combat. D tier arrow. The arrow of Arcane Interference. So the Arcane Interference arrow breaks the target's concentration with no saving throw, so any enemy that's concentrating on a spell when hit with this arrow immediately loses concentration on it, exactly the same as if they had fallen over or you had cast Sleet Storm on them, no saving throw allowed, and they are silenced for 1 turn. Now, unfortunately, the silenced effect doesn't work, because silenced in Baldur's Gate 3 ticks down. The duration of the effect decreases at the beginning of the affected character's turn, and so they'll get a 1-turn duration silence, but as soon as their turn starts, they will become unsilenced and immediately able to cast a spell. The silence can be useful because it can stop an enemy from casting a counterspell or a Hellish Rebuke or other reaction-based spell effect, which some of which are prevented by silence and some of which aren't. In Baldur's Gate 3, the way silence interacts with reaction spells is somewhat inconsistent, and so this, I think, usually works to stop an enemy who's going to counterspell, but I haven't proved that it works 100% of the time to stop an enemy that's going to counterspell. And I've seen enemies cast shield and stuff like that while silenced, so at least some reaction spells still work while silenced, which is kind of annoying. Arrow of Arcane Interference therefore doesn't do the thing that it's supposed to do, but the thing that it actually does do is still pretty good. Breaking enemy concentration guaranteed is fine. Obviously, if you are an archery build who is spec'd into archery, then you're very likely to break enemy concentration regardless, just from doing a bunch of damage and having them fail the concentration save. But making that guaranteed is pretty nice if an enemy is concentrating on hold person or a dangerous spell for you. And the real use for this is to let your party members who are dex-based but not spec'd into archery reliably break enemy concentration at range. If you have a bow equipped on your melee rogue or your dex-based monk or something like that, and these arrows, then even if they can't reach an enemy spellcaster on their turn, they still have an option to reliably break that enemy's concentration, because the Arcane Interference arrow will just break the concentration. How often is that scenario going to come up in actual gameplay? I would say not very often. How often are you going to have the first action that you take be silence an enemy who you know has counterspell? A little bit more often, but either way, the Arcane Interference arrow, unfortunately, because it looks incredible and I wish it was better, mostly is not going to come up, because the way that the duration works with silence just means that it doesn't do the thing it's supposed to do. So it's a marginal but still reasonable effect in a lot of circumstances. Breaking enemy concentration guaranteed with non-archery characters is pretty good, though they do have to be dexterity based, because you have to actually hit the enemy with it, so you need at least a decent chance of hitting the enemy with it before you decide to spend your turn on this. And the silence effect can come up for reaction based spells or other off-turn effects. There's some legendary actions that you can silence enemies out of using, even when it's not their turn, because they can't like shout for help or something as a reaction. Overall, this arrow has some uses, and I'm going to put it in B tier, but it's relatively marginal. I wish that it worked the way that it, I think, was intended to work, because then it would be extremely powerful and very cool. But as is, you are going to get the occasional use out of this, but not that much. The Arrow of Many Targets. So the Arrow of Many Targets deals normal weapon damage, and then deals half weapon damage to up to 3 additional targets within range. This already seems like a very powerful arrow, just dealing effectively 2.5 times damage if there's enough enemies in the encounter. But when you actually dig into how it works, that description belies just how insanely powerful the arrow of many targets is. So firstly, it rolls your attack roll against each of these enemies. So if there's multiple enemies in the encounter, it increases your chance of getting a critical hit against at least one of them, because you're just making a lot of attacks. Secondly, the way that the damage halving works is the same as Tiger Barbarian's half damage swing, and different from the slaying arrow's doubling damage. It only halves the source damage of the weapon. So just the actual weapon damage die, your ability score modifier, and any weapon enhancement that it has. Any additional damage that's added to your attacks don't get halved and get applied as full damage to all of the enemies. So if the weapon has any elemental damage dice associated with it, if you have any elemental damage dice added to your weapon attacks from gear or from abilities or anything like that. If you have the sharpshooter feat, none of those things are halved, and so you end up in practice, getting very close to just a 4 times damage attack if there's 4 enemies in the encounter. It ends up being something like, in the late game, doing roughly 3.5 times as much damage as a normal attack would do, maybe even a little bit more than that. The arrow of many targets also, because it rolls an attack against each enemy, can get you extra critical hits, and there's a weird bug where if the first attack roll it critically hits, subsequent attack rolls sometimes, and I haven't been able to reliably reproduce this, but I've seen it happen pretty frequently, sometimes just get automatic critical hits without having to roll dice for their attack rolls at all. So sometimes there's a bug and you just get 4 critical hits off of this without having to roll dice for the second 3, if your first attack happens to be a critical. So it combines extremely well with gear that increases your critical hit chance in order to more reliably trigger that bug and guarantee even more critical hits. That's not even mentioning the fact that there's lots of effects in the game that trigger when you hit an enemy with an attack. Arcane Acuity is the most notable one, and hitting 4 enemies with this attack gives you immediately 4 weapon stacks of Arcane Acuity if you're using the Helm of Arcane Acuity. So that's the fastest way in the game to stack up one of the most broken mechanics in the game, as with the many targets arrow. So even aside from all of the incredible synergy that this weapon has, it also gives you way more damage than the tooltip seems to indicate, which was already way more damage than it should probably have done. The Arrow of Many Targets is just an insanely powerful tool that just completely breaks the combat math by making your single attack be worth wildly more damage, wildly more effects, because it lets you stack all of the on-hit effects that your character might have on multiple enemies, and also stack them all on yourself if you get charges of something from hitting enemies, and just completely obliterates encounters all on its own. The only downside is that you can't use it alongside like slashing flourishes, because you can't use special arrows and special attacks at the same time, but other than that, the Many Targets arrow just wipes encounters on its own, S+ tier. The arrow of salving. So the salving arrow works a little bit differently than all of the other arrows, because it's not a damaging arrow, it's one that you fire at an ally in order to provide a beneficial effect. In this case, it lets you remove poisoned, paralyzed, and blinded, so some pretty dangerous conditions, especially paralyzed, is very good to be able to get rid of, in exchange just for an attack action. So on many characters, that's only half of their turn spent doing that, something that would otherwise take a full turn to cast Lesser Restoration or something on your ally in order to break them, or Freedom of Movement in order to break them out of those effects. The Salving Arrow therefore can help be effectively a level 2 spell as a panic button used as an attack. A level 2 spell used as an attack that doesn't cost you a spell slot is a pretty nice thing. Granted, Lesser Restoration is not the most useful spell, not the most powerful spell, but it's definitely one that's useful to have in your back pocket, and one that will come up occasionally in combat. And the great thing about the Arrow of Salving is that it always hits. No matter what character is firing it at whom, if you're firing it at an ally, it always has a 100% chance to hit. So you can have one of these on each of your characters to use in an emergency, and you will always be able to make use of it. Sometimes the best turn that your character can take is breaking your ally out of hold person or whatever, and the Arrow of Salving lets you do that. often the best way to do that will be to hit the enemy with something that makes them drop concentration, but sometimes you just don't have that option, and having the option to just solve a problem with a 100% guaranteed efficiency and not spending particularly important resources or particularly important actions on it is always great. The Arrow of Salving, I think, because it doesn't come up that often, I'm going to put it in B tier, but I do recommend carrying a few of these on your party, especially on characters that don't have access to panic buttons like Lesser Restoration naturally, because that can let you break out allies when you need to, and while this will come up very rarely, it's probably maybe like a once a playthrough thing. When you want it, you'll be very glad you have it. The Smokepowder Arrow. So the Smokepowder Arrow is available starting in Act 2, and it allows you to fire an arrow that does normal weapon damage, but also does 4d6 fire damage and 4d6 force damage, so 8d6 damage in total, to enemies within a 17-foot radius AoE of the blast. That's exactly the same as a fireball, both the same damage and the same radius, but better because the split damage between fire and force is a little bit better than fireballs. Pure fire damage. Force damage is less easily resisted by enemies. There's fewer enemies that resist it, and also there's some enemies who are weak to it, so having a better fireball able to be fired from your arrow is obviously extremely powerful. It also has a secondary effect where enemies who are caught in the blast must make a saving throw, a DC 15 saving throw, or they are launched 10 feet out of the center of the blast, so it just knocks them back a reasonable distance as well, so you can use it to knock enemies off of high ground and stuff. Mostly you're going to be using this for the extra damage, but repositioning enemies is very powerful. Both of these effects have a save DC, a dexterity save DC 15 to have the damage and negate the knockback, although they are rolled separately, so enemies could sometimes suffer full damage and not the knockback, but could suffer full damage and not get knocked back, or suffer half damage and still get knocked back. But the ability to both reposition enemies and deal a massive amount of bonus damage just on an attack is incredibly powerful. You're effectively just getting a 3rd level spell here whenever you fire a Smokepowder arrow, and a 3rd level spell as an attack action, so you can do multiple of them in a turn. A 3rd level spell alongside a weapon attack, so you get a whole bunch of extra damage if you're doing this as an archer, and a 3rd level spell that just costs you gold and doesn't cost you a spell slot or any day-long resources is ridiculously powerful. The amount of damage that you'll output with these Smokepowder bombs is Smokepowder arrows is massive. You can also use it to set off bombs and grenades and stuff because it's a big fire explosion, so you can stack it with additional explosive charges if that's something that you want to do. It can be used to light fires as well, because it's a gigantic AoE fire explosion, so it can light fires for things that are vulnerable to being lit on fire and let you get a little bit of additional damage from the fire surface. But mostly just an arrow of fireball is an incredible thing for an arrow to be. It massively increases the damage of your character, even though the save DC is relatively low and targets dexterity, not typically a great save to target, usually the second worst after Constitution. Dexterity, you will still just do incredible damage with this arrow because it adds so much extra damage to your attack. I said, the 1d4 extra guaranteed damage that we get from the fire arrow is worth quite a bit just because guaranteed damage is so powerful. Well, the Smokepowder arrow does guaranteed 4d6 of damage at minimum, plus the damage from your attack, plus the damage if they fail the save, plus the knockback. Incredible item, S+ tier weapon, and absolutely worth using in many encounters throughout the game. And finally, the Arrow of Transposition. So this is another utility arrow, and how this one works is that wherever you fire the arrow, it will teleport the character who fired that arrow. Most bows have a range of 60 feet, and you can't, under most circumstances, increase the range of your attacks past that 60 feet, so this is effectively casting Misty Step, just an attack but with an attack action rather than a bonus action. Usually casting Misty Step is something you would rather do with a bonus action than with an attack action, but repositioning your characters is very powerful. Teleportation is incredibly useful. So there are definitely some circumstances where you have a more important bonus action that you need to do and want to still teleport on your turn, so the Transposition arrow can be used to do that. Also worth noting that you can both Misty Step and Transposition in the same turn to get 120 feet of teleportation. So if you really need to go a very long distance, this gives you a lot of extra uses for that as well. The ability to just spend an action to teleport yourself 60 feet is incredibly useful for non-archer characters as well, because you can just spend any action to teleport yourself 60 feet. Obviously, this isn't one that's going to come up that often, and it's not something that you would prepare as a spell. Like, typically, Dimension Door isn't a spell that you would prepare under most circumstances because it's very expensive, but when it's totally free with the Transposition arrow, it's much, much more interesting. That being said, the fact that this will require an action to use or an attack action if you have extra attack means that it is unlikely to come up in circumstances where it wouldn't be better just to have Misty Step on the character, because usually a bonus action is more useful, or just jumping or something like that. So while this can come up in non-story events, and there are some combat circumstances where it would be better to have this than Misty Step, and of course it doesn't require the same resource expenditure as Misty Step, it's still going to be used relatively rarely. I think this is a fairly powerful effect and worth keeping an eye on. Similar to the arrow of Salving, it's one where when you want it, you'll really want it, and so having one of these just on every character to be able to make an action teleport if they happen to need one is very useful. And of course it also only works in to areas that you can actually hit with an arrow, so if there's a wall in the way or if there's something blocking the way, you won't be able to teleport to that area, so it's slightly more restrictive than Misty Step as well, which just needs you to be able to see the target, not actually shoot the target. But the arrow of Transposition overall is going to come up occasionally, be useful to have on every character in case you need it, but not one that is going to be a primary plan for mobility. That's definitely going to be jumps and Misty Step instead, so I'm going to place it in B tier, where it's reasonably useful, but not mandatory. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at all the special arrows in Baldur's Gate 3. One thing that really became clear to me as I was going through these arrows is just how good the special arrows are. Obviously, that's something that I knew going in, or I wouldn't have decided to do this tier list, but I was really struck by how many of them I rated in the high tiers. Honestly, I would have expected a distribution that was more sort of the opposite curve of this, with many more in the lower tiers, but the fact that they just have so little opportunity cost, they don't cost you an additional action to use, they're very widely usable, especially the ones that don't actually need to hit the enemies in order to have good effect. So you can benefit from these on your entire party. It just means that this is such a powerful tool in your arsenal. Hopefully you found it useful and it encourages you to get more use out of the special arrows, because I guarantee it will make your playthroughs both more fun and more interesting, because you're making more decisions on every turn of combat when you're choosing which arrows to use, rather than just using the attack button over and over, and of course it will make your parties much more powerful. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm. And of course, as always with these tier lists, if you think there's something that I've misplaced, definitely do not hesitate to let me know. I'm very open to feedback if there is something that you think I've underrated or overrated. Especially underrated, I think I'm much more likely to adjust things up than down. Historically, but definitely let me know if you think there's an item here that I have misplaced, and of course you can feel free to subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.